So my comments will be more along the line of comments. So I'm not going to read to you the paper. In fact, thank you for the mention of my Pasolini book, which, as you mentioned, was very much, that inquiry is very much organized around thinking about Pasolini's work in relationship to the built environment in Rome in the post-war period. And in fact, actually, that book began its life as what was meant to have been a book about 3 different directors located in, and one of whom was going to be Antonioni. And what happened was I wrote the Pasolini chapter first, and it kind of overgrew its boundaries, and so I kind of made that a Pasolini book, and then was able to come. But actually, the whole project began with Antonioni. I kind of imagined the project about thinking about Rome's built culture in relationship to film culture in regards, first and foremost, to Antonioni's practice. And eventually, I think eventually the image will come up. I just have really one slide that I want to show you. One of the things, it's interesting that I'm glad that we saw that you looked at Gente del Po, because that film is a very interesting and problematic example of Antonioni's practice. And recent scholars, particularly Noah Steinmatsky, whose work my own work has been in conversation with, and who was a friend, and also work by Leonardo Quaresima, who has published an essay in the book that Laura and I edited in. Steinmatsky and Quaresima have really tried to look very closely and carefully at Gente del Po to kind of understand it as actually a very ambiguous and ambivalent document. It's traditionally been read very much in the terms that you were just sort of laying out as this kind of heroic refusal of officious fascist culture. But it actually, fascist culture was able at a variety of moments to endorse the regional and to endorse a kind of quotidian experience. And so the film sort of participates in, at the same time that it seems like a kind of covert, smuggled in negation of officious fascist culture, it also harbors inside it, or organizes inside it, some sort of residue of other elements of fascist experience. And Noah Steinmatsky in particular has thought about the film in relationship to aeropintura, the sort of fascist school of painting in which the landscape is regarded from above, from the point of view of an airplane, or from the non-human point of view of an airplane. And that view of the landscape from above comes across particularly, in the photographs that initially accompanied an article about that documentary that Antonioni published in advance of the film. And so we can situate that film, and I think a lot of Antonioni's practice thereafter, as hovering either exhilaratingly or uncomfortably on the border of what we crudely would term realism or modernism. And I know that those are kind of empty signifiers, but they're nonetheless, their emptiness is probably very useful to us in some way. Not to invoke necessarily Ernesto Lafalle's notion of the empty signifier, but I think we kind of know more or less what we're talking about when we talk about realism and modernism, even though those things cannot be neatly separated or kept apart. So along those lines, I just thought, given the remit of the day, thinking about Antonioni in relationship to the other arts, and that's a conversation that could take us into so many different directions, partly because I think Antonioni's practice was so radically porous. And that's, I think, one of the really powerful legacies and examples of this work is its porosity. It's work that really kind of lays itself open to its own historical moment. And this is, of course, why Antonioni has often been charged with becoming very dated. That we think we've, in a way, many people feel like we've sort of outgrown his films, that the kind of cool chic of a film like La Ventura feels to us sort of dated now. It kind of belongs to a generation of art films, and it's hard to sort of resuscitate an understanding of their seriousness. Other films that have succumbed to that charge are, of course, Blow Up and Zabriskie Point. Others, even more, that have absolutely almost been expunged from the canon are films like Identification of a Woman from the early 1980s. But this, in a sense, the elements in Antonioni's work that make his work vulnerable to becoming dated, I think are also the elements of his work that are very powerful, because the work is really open to history. It takes its historical moment very seriously. It's trying to work through the materials of its given historical moment, not in a way that ultimately remands them to that historical moment or forces them to remain there and only there. But I think the films are interesting examples of thinking about an aesthetic practice, a theoretical practice, in relationship to history. And so whatever their historicity, whatever their kind of intensely periodized feel, even if we feel that they might be radically dated, I think his films, at their best, always exemplify this kind of serious attitude towards historical materials. So, kind of along those lines, I wanted to just show this picture, this reproduction of a painting by Mario Maffei, a member of the Roman School of Painters. This is from 1936, Demolitions on Via Giulia, and it's from a series of paintings that Maffei undertook in the 1930s that he called his Sventramenti, and I'm sure, I gather that there are a lot of Italianists in the audience tonight, but the Sventramenti were demolitions, literally disembowelings of Rome's urban fabric, particularly right in the center of Rome, that were undertaken by the fascist government for a variety of reasons, to clear various arterial networks for the movement of traffic through Rome's urban center, to isolate and remonumentalize certain particularly classical landmarks in Rome's center. So we think of the demolitions of the Sventramenti around the tomb of Caesar Augustus, which just lies right off the Corso. The fascist Sventramenti were actually really a part of a longer history that includes the Sventramenti undertaken by the post-unification government. And so one thing that's hard to, I think even for those of us who have an attachment to Rome or who are Italianists, who have spent a lot of time in the city, something about the way Piazza Venezia works and the way that the approach from Piazza Venezia to the Colosseum and then down to the Theater of Marcellus, all of that has become kind of weirdly naturalized for us. And what we don't see there are the buildings and the lives and the kinds of the intense living that had actually taken place in those areas up until the 1870s and then again up until the 1920s and 1930s. So actually that thing that everyone likes to dislike, the Vittoriano, to construct that required enormous demolitions around the Piazza Venezia, including Pietro da Cortona's own palazzo was demolished in order to make way for that. And that's kind of forgotten, and we tend to sort of focus just on the fascist Sventramenti because the ideological program under which they were undertaken is so obnoxious and odious. But there is this, I just want to point out, there is this longer history of demolition in Rome's center. Maffei lived on the Via Cavour, and his house actually was demolished in the 1930s, late 1920s, 1930s, to make way for the Via del, what was called then the Via dell'Impero, or now the Via dei Fori Imperiali. And so, again, caught in a way like a figure like Antonioni, with a desire to testify to and maybe document this history, but in a kind of a way that was sort of able to both communicate and testify to the kind of lived historical reality of that, but also in a muted enough or an abstract enough way so as not to arouse official fascist censorship. He undertook a series of these wonderful paintings, which he called the Sventramenti. And here, and I won't go on at any length about these, but what we literally see is the interior, now rendered exterior, now rendered open and porous, the interior of either a medieval or maybe a slightly later a set of buildings that would have obviously had shops or some sort of workplaces on the bottom, bodega of some sort, and then mostly working class or sort of artisanal laboring classes housing on the upper floors. So it's completely legible as what it is, a document of a ruin, and we might attribute to it or impute to it, any set of kind of mournful commentaries on this destruction of the city. It also, interestingly, immediately we look at it and we see the grid, the modernist grid. This sort of, it seems like perhaps this is merely an exercise in form. And so I think it very carefully and curiously and very productively situates itself right on that ambiguous border that separates realism and its attempt to engage with documentary evidence, right on that border of realism and more explicit forms of sort of rigorous, stylized modernism. And so then the slide I've wanted to pair with that is this very famous image from the end of l'Église. And here, these are just some of these familiar, for anyone who's familiar with an Italian building site, here are these sort of terracotta bricks that act as the infill of a larger structure. This image is taken, as is well known, probably to many of you, from an area that was then under rapid expansion, oeuvre, an area of Rome, outside of Rome, sort of on the way to Ostia, that began its life as what essentially was going to be a World's Fair, that was going to not only be a World's Fair, but also be an exposition that would celebrate the 20th anniversary of the fascist revolution. So it was going to take place in 1942. It was actually called pt.2. A lot of the big monumental neoclassicizing, kind of the things that we think of as emblematically fascist architecture were built at the core of oeuvre, but because of, obviously, the date at which the buildings were, construction was undertaken, the project was not completed for obvious reasons that I don't need to go into. So in the post-war period, though, it was a series of attempts were made to figure out what to do with it, and it was decided it could be a useful node for a kind of urban or suburban growth. A number of sort of white-collar businesses and offices. The offices of Eni, the big hydrocarbon conglomerate in Italy at the time, were located there. And so during the 50s and 60s, the Olympics, a lot of the Olympics from 1960 were held there. During this period, the area was under enormous development, underwent enormous rapid development. And this is where Monica Vitti lives, and where she often meets Alain Delon for their various dates across the film. And of course, as you know, this image is one of a series of images that take the place of this meeting, we think, between Monica Vitti and Alain Delon. And so instead of this, they make an appointment to meet at the corner of the Viale della Tecnica and the Viale del Ciclismo. And we assume that the camera is there, and we are there via the camera's agency, and they're not there. And so the film has always been read as this, as a sort of modernist lamentation about the impossibility of human relations and this kind of existentialist key. What I've attempted to do in some work that I've written in both the Antonioni book that Laura and I edited, and in another article that I've written specifically about oeuvre and its sort of cinematic afterlives, is to sort of read this sequence a little bit more metonymically and to think of it as, what kind of space was oeuvre? Is it enough just to kind of write it off as a part of a fascist history? What had it become and what was it on the way to becoming during that period? And so I just thought it would be like a sort of interesting companion to the Maffei. This is a neighborhood that is rapidly being developed, of course. But its development is linked to this longer history that includes the sort of unmaking of the city in the center. So it suggests to me, in a sense, the power of Antonioni's practice and the interest of this practice, and also, and I'm not in any way trying to kind of undermine his originality, but just maybe to situate him in relationship to other practitioners in Italy who have, I think, tried to occupy a similar terrain on that ambivalent border that separates, or doesn't separate, that porous seam that so productively and fluidly acts as this kind of border or barrier between realism and modernism. So I think thinking about Antonioni in these kind of historically materialist or materialist ways, but also in relationship to sort of the materiality of art history and the materiality of the other examples of art history and its imbrication in other material histories can be a productive way of not rescuing or redeeming, but just ensuring, kind of broadening and expanding the conversation about Antonioni so that we don't think that when we turn to speak about him, we're just talking about this cool modernist auteurist about whom there is nothing to say anymore, which is certainly the way. I mean, I know, for instance, when Laura and I first proposed the book to the BFI, even though it immediately, got a lot of support from its readers, there was a sense like, oh, well, don't we already know everything about Antonioni? And in fact, the reception of his work has, the things that have been said about him, I think, have been fairly restricted in a way, partly because the reception has sort of in a way been enthralled to a modernist version of Antonioni. And I don't by any means mean to disavow or entirely to displace that, but I think there are other stories that the films are able to tell and other stories that we're able to tell about them. And so, and this is just one way maybe of going about that work. So there's probably more to say, but I think I'll stop there if that's okay. Yeah?
That's fine,
okay.
Yes. Yeah.
One thing I might mention, and one of the ways that a painting like this does occupy a very interesting and ambiguous space, is that fascist documentaries and documentary photography commissioned and made by Istituto Luce in these same years absolutely celebrated these Ventrimenti, and so this was like an advertised event, and like this was seen as fascist progress. So in a sense, one could, a historical observer could have said, oh yes, yet another testimony to fascist urban progress. And yet, I think there's something about the materiality of the paintings that tells a slightly different story, and yet there's certainly, one could imagine Maffei assimilating them to an official narrative as a means of actually smuggling in a note of discord, which is probably about all that could have been expected from an artist who still wanted to be able to show work in the 1930s. So I just wanted to add that. Yeah.
No, absolutely. That's very incredibly interesting. But I think, it ties in with some of the things that you were saying, that there is a sort of kind of degree of ambiguity around. I mean, you talk very well, I think, about this border area between realism and modernism, and between neorealism and cinematic realism. And I thought actually that's something that I have to confess I hadn't seen Gente del Po until today, which probably, being one of the organisers, isn't a very good thing. But one of the things that I thought was very fascinating is the way in which there seems to be this fascination for that coastal region, the kind of marshy land, which clearly to an Italian in 1947, it's just impossible that you would have not reminded them of the whole fascist rhetoric of the surrounding the reclamation of the marshes in other areas of the country. So yet again you have something there that to me speaks to a certain degree of at least some marginal ambiguity.
Also,
it's a sort of, in many ways, a kind of, very. It's a difficult sort of.
Yes, yeah. When he returns to that same place in Il Grido, Ponte Lago Scuro, what's happening are that the beetroot fields are being churned up, and so this way of life that is predicated on the sugar industry is being lost, and what seems to be going in is some sort of an airport, and it's not really clear if it's a military airport or something that the Americans are building or whatever. But so you kind of have this sense of like, oh, okay, what's being like something from a heightened form of cultural and social modernity is displacing some sort of older relationship to the landscape. However, the beetroot, the sugar industry that was developed around the cultivation of the beetroot only extends back to the 19th century and was an attempt to provide, in a proto-fascist way, a kind of to provide for some sort of autochthonous, we should be able to provide for our own sugar needs in some sense. And ultimately raising beetroot in Italy is more expensive than just importing it from Central and Eastern Europe. So you kind of, even there, inside that film, there are these like stranded historical materials that would seem to lend themselves quite to a kind of pat, mournful reading about the displacement of a settled way of life by a sort of more modern way of life. But actually, that more settled way of life is its own form of cultural modernity that actually has a much more interesting and more complicated recent past, in some sense. Now, Antonioni doesn't tell us that, but he sort of suspends historical materials through a stylized gaze. And that compels us to look in a way we're not quite sure why we're looking at what we're looking, but it's something about that mode of stylization that makes us aware that whatever is being seen is worth looking at in some way.
The voice of Monica Vitti really works very well with the images. So every commentary is really a description of the image that we can see. So for example, on all the details of the boat that we saw, Monica was saying il barcone. Il barcone means the boat. And il barcone è la loro casa. The boat is their home. And so all the films were showing this hard life of these people living on the Po, but at the same time, it was stressing how much the river is important for them, because the river is their home, their feelings, their love is where they are making love, as Leonardo Quaresima was saying in the book, in Centenary books. So there is this a little bit dichotomy between of this element, and the moment where, do you remember? Maybe almost at the end of the documentary, when Antonioni camera focuses on all this water entering the village, and Monica at that time was saying the salted water from the sea and the sweet water from the river, and all together they went all together to cover the small town. And so I'm really sorry that you couldn't hear that, but for me, it was really, it's this point, this documentary, it's really where Monica's relationship with Antonioni, as Laura said, started. And they started very professional, but also the time, I think, personal relationship, because they seem really in synchrony, the image and the voice.
There is that very plain, almost, description of the barge as the home that goes so well with the image of everyday life. There's a child taken ill, a mother that feeds her, and so on. And the joys as well of living on the river, the love-making, which brings us back to one of the huge strands, that is the love of beauty, of course, and the ability to see beauty in what we do. It's true, of course, that, or at least I found it, I don't know if anyone else would agree, during the storm sequence in Gente del Po, you hear a slight sort of, if not populist, you hear the commentary talk about the harshness of life in the Tuguri, which is the shacks, the miserable life, and that of course could lend itself to appropriation on the part of that strand of fascism that redevelops and reappropriates land under the guise of risanamento, of good health and of good social policy. For as you say, and again, but this is a very small comment, it's interesting when you say fascism endorses regionalism, which... When
it was useful to do so.
Yeah.
No, I don't mean in a blanket way.
Tiny point there to make. I was just reminded of Pasolini's point in reading through letters and how tragically he makes that point when he says fascism will expropriate those values of regionalism, whilst at the same time making it impossible for people to access now.
Yes.
So it's, there is an element, again, of Istituto Luce in Gente del Po, which could be taken that way. But I thought the strength of it, of presenting life for the people as it is, with an eye for its beauty, took it just above that.
And I would also, since Leonardo's articles come up and that's in our book, I actually would also really, I don't know if anyone's read Noah Steinmatzky's book, Italian Locations, but there's a more, she reads not only the film, but this very famous article that was published in Cinema that sort of planned the film and really reads the photographs that were taken to accompany the article very closely in a lot of what I'm thinking about in terms of that delicate and somewhat ambivalent relationship to the regional as both sort of there, but also something that's always being abstracted or instrumentalized is really developed in that her chapter on Antonioni, so direct interested people to that work.
I would like to set a question of Laura's tool, and maybe a chance to bring in Dominic Paimi, who is there at the back. I'm very fortunate he's bride. Will be part of the round table with the excellent help of Alix, Angela's assistant. Because it does actually relate to Godard, in fact, the Godard link that you were, I think, making, but maybe you could explain and expand on this, Laura, because you talked about the fact that Antonioni is bringing up the body of cinema, which I thought was a lovely phrase, sort of the materiality, plasticity of cinema you're emphasizing.
I was focused on not falling from the stairs.
Which is simply the phrase, a very suggestive phrase of bringing up or bringing back, I'm not quite sure how you phrased it, the body of cinema, the materiality of cinema, the plasticity of cinema, which you, I think, were both emphasizing in different ways, and the fact that you refer naturally to Godard and Histoire du Cinéma, and you took that wonderful image from, I think it's 3A, from Histoire du Cinéma, which is the Manet, and the phrase you had there, which is "Je sais à quoi tu penses," I know what you're thinking, but the sense of always cinema as being self-reflexive and self-referential. It can be other things and always other things, but it's always that as well. I just wonder, and it's something maybe that Dominic may want to bring in at this point too, this idea of the fact that cinema, with someone like Antonioni and Godard, is always about the body of cinema, and that can have its sort of avatars and sort of origins, and one of them is certainly modern painting like Manet. I wonder if you can maybe just amplify a little bit more about what you meant by the body of cinema and how it relates aesthetically to Godard.
Well, I guess that that question is particularly relevant for the two films that we are talking about, which are Antonioni's last film and Godard's recent, although not recent, Histoire du Cinéma, because they both are post-cinema in a sense. I mean, Histoire du Cinéma is a video and it's a museum of the cinema, it's a museum of the century of the cinema and of the cinema itself. And so it's a film that comes after the cinema in a sense, and that it looks back and it tries to sort of bring back the body of cinema from the point of view of Godard's own reading of the history of film. Of course, Antonioni's film is very different. I mean, Godard's is incredibly ambitious in many ways. It's a summa, of his thoughts about what film is in comparison to, well, in the context of history, but also compared to the other arts and the fine arts and painting, etc. Antonioni's operation is much more modest in many ways. It's much smaller. It's much, but both films, in a sense, are the films of two intellectual filmmakers who, after the end of cinema, in a sense, look back and try to bring back the body of cinema through other media as well. Video, the
the operation of Antonioni on his body as well, etc. So I guess that was the connection that I was trying to make there. I don't know whether I capture what he wanted me to get.
Well, no, I mean, and the fact that they're both self-portraits,
yes.
It's a self-portrait.
Absolutely.
As well as
Godard is abundantly present in his film as well,
yeah.
you know, so in person as well, yeah.
But I suppose my question is much more sort of crude in a sense.
Yeah.
I mean, is Antonioni's body of cinema the same or different from Godard's? And how do we define a body of cinema? It clearly has links with all the other arts. I think what we're saying here is that the cinema is always to do with the fine arts in both cases, except that with Godard and Histoire du Cinéma, it's always about trying to find the specificity of cinema through video. In fact, he cinematics through video. But to find the specificity of the cinematic body, is the body in Antonioni, the body of cinema, much more open and fluid? I'm getting a sense that it might be, in fact, that it's not quite so codified as the body of cinema. That's a much more open and fluid and fruitful, perhaps, idea for Antonioni.
Because they are two very different operations, I mean, Godard's being much more complex and long, etc. And dealing, I mean, John David was talking about historical materials, and I think that is a key element there. I mean, Godard does a lot with the idea of the historical material there in that film, whereas Antonioni, because I think he's obviously it's a much narrower take on it. Like he's actually moving away from that point of view. But if you want to open it to Antonioni's work more in general, then the presence of historical materials is there, as John David has shown very, very smartly. And it's there possibly in a way that is overlooked, and Antonioni is seen as this sort of abstract champion of modernist abstraction. But ultimately those historical materials are there very, very powerfully, very strongly, and possibly our gaze doesn't quite see them instinctively. Whereas Godard's, I mean, his historical materials are overtly there. They call our attention all the time, and that they are totally. So, if you want to compare the two bodies of their work, I would say that really is what stands out. I mean, they're two filmmakers, of course, highly interested in the visual, highly interested in art history. Both, come from an interest in comparing film and thinking about the medium of film through the comparison with the fine arts, etc. But there's a massive difference in which they deal with the historical materials, I think, but they both do deal with them. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I wonder if there are any comments that maybe Dominique would like to come in at that point at all.
La question essentielle qui sépare les deux cinéastes, c'est la question de la reproduction. Antonioni se confronte encore aux œuvres réelles, au marbre, à la sculpture réelle. Il va toucher. Godard, c'est le grand passage où un cinéaste prend véritablement le cinéma pour ses capacités de reproduction. Et donc c'est depuis ces possibilités de reproduction que Godard regarde toute l'histoire ancienne, mais en regardant toute l'histoire ancienne comme ayant été reproduite, imprimée, filmée déjà. Antonioni regarde le Michel-Ange comme s'il n'avait jamais été encore filmé. C'est la grande... c'est pour ça que les deux cinéastes, on peut avoir, sauf pour des raisons de narration. Godard est très très impressionné par Antonioni quand il le rencontre, quand il rencontre ses premiers films. Et il est probable que Le Mépris de Godard n'est pas un film héritier de Rossellini, comme on l'a dit souvent, de Voyage en Italie. Il est probablement vraiment le film qui vient de l'Aventure. Et vraiment, là il y a un vrai passage entre l'Aventura et Le Mépris. Mais pour la question qui était posée avant, je crois vraiment que ce qui sépare les deux cinéastes, c'est la question de la reproduction.
There's a huge difference between Antonioni and Godard, because Godard actually considers art through reproduction, whereas Antonioni, when he looks at the Moses in this church, it's as if this statue had never been shot and looked at before. Denis Payne added that if there was a shared point of view between the two, is the way actually Antonioni uses the narrative, and Denis thinks that Le Mépris de Godard is influenced by L'Aventure. But for the question of, the difference between the two is the reproduction. Godard works and considers art as reproduction.
Si Godard avait parlé du Moïse de Michel-Ange, il aurait pris une photographie du Moïse de Michel-Ange. Il n'aurait pas été filmé, il n'aurait pas filmé dans l'église de Venticoli. Il n'aurait pas mis sa caméra devant le Moïse de Michel-Ange. C'est ça la grande différence entre les deux cinéastes.
No, a quick example. I mean, if Godard had decided to work with Moses, he would never actually have been in front and shot this statue, but would have taken a photo of the statue.
I mean, it's clear that there's very different approaches there, and you formalise that very clearly. The body is always reproduced in Godard, and that's not always the case, certainly not here in the film that we saw of Antonioni, but is there any sense of making an evaluation on that process in Godard? The fact that it's never quite that sort of hands-on feel, touch of the real object.
La relation au corps chez Godard, il éloigne beaucoup le corps. Godard éloigne beaucoup le corps dans son cinéma parce que depuis le début de son œuvre, il a voulu, lui, mettre son propre corps dans les films. Il a voulu lui-même apparaître et mettre son corps à l'épreuve. Il a été un acteur burlesque merveilleux. Et c'est pour ça, je crois, qu'il a regardé les corps en les photographiant et même parfois en faisant même des reproductions de photocopies, des mauvaises images, des corps qu'il met dans ses films. Quand il cite un tableau de Renoir, il ne prend même pas une photo de Renoir, il prend une photo en noir et blanc d'un tableau de Renoir. Il y a vraiment un principe d'éloignement. Bon. Antonioni est un cinéaste qui a connu une très étrange histoire personnelle où son corps s'est arrêté. Alors qu'il avait une très grande proximité avec le corps de ses actrices, ce qui n'a jamais été le corps de Godard, ou alors ça a été sous une forme extrêmement parodique. C'est la fameuse séquence avec Brigitte Bardot au début du Mépris, et après, ou alors c'est le corps de la Vierge dans Je vous salue Marie, mais il a toujours beaucoup éloigné les corps, Jean-Luc Godard. Donc c'est vraiment deux cinéastes deux cinéastes qui n'ont pas de point commun sur la question du corps. Ils ont, je crois, un point commun à un moment donné sur la question narrative. C'est sur le récit, c'est sur la narration qu'il y a eu quelque chose d'essentiel avec l'aventure. Je crois. Et après les deux cinéastes se sont beaucoup séparés. Il y a vraiment, enfin, j'ai toujours considéré qu'il y avait très peu de possibilités, très peu de critères pour les comparer.
Yeah, and just to sum up the Miss-Payne's ideas, he really thinks that there is really very few common interests between the two filmmakers, although they are linked by the narrative question. Both indeed put away the body, even if Godard staged in his films his own body, and even if Antonioni in a way was interested by his actresses' bodies, but both in a way put away the body, and that's the only thing they have in common.
I mean, I always think that, I was just thinking the other day about neorealism in Italian literature and how, you know, with the exception to an extent, Vittorio Calvino's first novel, Il Sentiero di Ragno, has been completely taken away from the Italian canon. And in many ways, you know, these days, you know, if you think about neorealism, you only think of it in cinematic terms, and a whole body of literature has, you know, disappeared from the canon, from, you know, the literary radar. So that's the only thing I can think of, but I mean, I'm sure.
I mean, they're by any means, my knowledge of the literature is shallow at best, but I mean, two things that I remember reading in order to think about some of the things that I was talking about was the Calvino, the short novel Speculazioni Edilizia, which obviously, you know, is involved in the same history. I mean, that's maybe a bit of a superficial connection, but I mean, a lot of people have made, when people have tried to think about Antonioni in relation to other literary objects, often Calvino has been one of those, but also Moravia's La Noia has been understood in terms that are similar to the Great Trilogy, for instance. That seems to be, I think they probably have more to do with each other on the level of content, maybe, than form. But they clearly are apart, both historically and in terms of the world that they're trying to represent. La Noia and something like L'Avventura are a part of the same, they're working with the same historical materials, certainly. And there might be something about, I know Moravia was frequently translated into English by William Weaver, and I think William Weaver has written or talked about somewhere the fact that people always say, like, Moravia writes badly or he writes boringly or something. So even though, like, at the level of syntax and the level of the sentence, there may not be the syntactical difficulty that we might find with certain passages in Antonioni. Something about an experimentation with duration or the endurance of maybe something that is kind of boring or uneventful. They might have that in common somewhere at the level of form, and I understand that these, comparing the form of a novel to a film can be a tiresome and fruitless exercise at times, but there might be something to think about there. That's as far as I probably should go. I'll just say briefly, I mean, I think in a way your question kind of answers itself in a way, which is not to diminish the question, but it's who he was. I think you're right. And I think that we can see that in other documentaries as well. There's a kind of interesting continuity that, I mean, maybe maybe it's explainable in terms of contingency made this other documentary called Sette Cani un Vestito that traces how cane becomes a rayon dress or a rayon shirt. And there we were really in the world of the factory, and the camera's been really interested in the relationship between agriculture and the factory and this kind of technologized marvel of the rayon factory. And that you can already sense, like, in this kind of kind of literally quotidian medium of sort of Giulliana, there is. I think it would be silly not to trace some line of continuity about it, thinking about the relationship between technological modernity and agriculture and the landscape, and how those things impact figure-ground relations or other less purely formal things as well. So I think, yes, I think he probably took every minor opportunity that he was given by the film industry and did something a little bit more than what would have been expected or demanded from the situation.
But how problematic, sorry to interrupt, how problematic is that in terms of the kind of links and legacies of fascist propaganda and...
But it's a post-war documentary, but it's kind of, I know rayon.
Sorry, not specifically that, but the aesthetics of sort of the machine, the aesthetic of technology.
But that's at the same time, everything is soiled at that point in a way, but at the same time there's also the history of technological modernity expands beyond Italy. Italy is penetrated by that history, and so it's a clearly very delicate operation. So you could see Sette Cani un Vestito as just being a weird post-war continuation of the invocation of the rayon industry by the fascists as this fabulous kind of making thing, and yet it's also something else. So there are residual traces of obnoxious ideology or a fantasy